This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Hello and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is Friday, April 11th. I'm Kirsten Korosek, transportation editor at TechCrunch.
I'm Max Zeff, a senior reporter with TechCrunch.
And I'm Anthony Ha, weekend editor at TechCrunch. And there are all kinds of insane things we could talk about from this past week. And we'll get into some of them. But Max, I think you were going to start us off with something crazy that happened at the very beginning of the week.
Yeah, so this week got off to a crazy start when on Monday, a news aggregator account on X known as Walter Bloomberg, which has no connection to Bloomberg News, posted a false report declaring that President Trump was considering a 90-day pause on his controversial tariff proposal. The headline that he posted, which is since deleted, has it, Trump is considering a 90-day pause in tariffs for all countries except China. This caused a huge surge in the stock market, but then when it was found out to be true, it plummeted. But this was all the more confusing when on Wednesday, Trump actually announced this exact thing.
I was going to jump in and be like, was it false? Because in the end, it ended up being a 90-day pause in tariffs, which we're going to probably talk about later. But I did want to note that in that surge, basically it was a whipsaw event. So extreme volatility in a short period of time, over about 30 minutes, $2.4 trillion or so was lost. So yeah, tweets matter, folks. Tweets matter.
Which I mean, yeah, we should talk more about the tariff side of it. But I also had another question, which is like, what is the deal with Walter Bloomberg? Because I see those tweets all the time, less than I used to because I spend less time on X. But like, he just seems to be like this, very rapid fire aggregator. But no one seems to know a lot about, or at least I haven't seen a lot of background of who it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's an anonymous account. And I think I would say 90% of the posts are just kind of taken from the Bloomberg terminal, just kind of those little snippets that appear on there if you've ever used one. But then there's other he takes kind of headlines and he kind of looks at interviews that are happening or maybe it's multiple people. But yeah, and that's what happened here. It was just kind of an aggressive interpretation of something. But we'll talk more about that later on the show.
Yeah, well, speaking of the show, on the show today, we have deals of the week from a secretive EV startup backed by Jeff Bezos and some genetic tinkering by Colossal Biosciences. Then we're going to get into all things tariffs and then talk about what Meta's Llama 4 says about the state of AI.
Kirsten, you mentioned at the top that Jeff Bezos is backing a secretive EV startup. You and Sean worked on this scoop for a very long time. Can you tell us more about what went into that?
So by a long time, it was about a year, coming on a year. And it all started sort of in a twofold way. Sean was looking into this startup that he stumbled upon because he was looking into another company and saw that someone had recently gone over to this company called Slate, started digging into it. Around the same time, I tossed out a few calls and emails to some sources and got a tip that Jeff Bezos was involved. And so there it started. And really, it's been an on again, off again sort of investigative story over the past year where we've just been like slowly digging into things, talking to people, trying to verify. And we kind of had an aha moment at the end of last year that finally kind of confirmed the Jeff Bezos piece. A lot of the other stuff had kind of already been confirmed through a bunch of different sources that we had.
And I mean, it sounds like it's not just, so Bezos is an investor, but it sounds like this is a company that also has some like deeper connections to Amazon as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the interesting thing is a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about Rivian's spin out, that sort of micromobility spin out called Also. This is in some ways reminiscent of it, with the exception that we're not talking about a publicly traded company. there's a company called Rebuild Manufacturing using that same prefix that Amazon loves to use, like Remars and, all of those other RE colon monikers.
It's so ugly.
Yeah. And it sticks in your brain, right? So we noticed it right away that what appears to have happened is that Rebuild Manufacturing, which is attached to a bunch of Amazon folks, including Jeff Wilke, in the confines of Rebuild, Slate was born, and then Slate then spun off. But they were both kind of secretive companies, so a lot of people just didn't realize the connection or the roots. But yes, Amazon DNA throughout Rebuild in particular, and now over at Slate. Slate also has a lot of folks from kind of some unexpected places, not your typical tech places. So Harley Davidson, Stellantis, which is the maker of Jeep, Chrysler, which is, again, Stellantis connected. So really interesting sort of manufacturing folks coming in, which once you learn about the business makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I had a question about that because, you write in the story that they're building this 2-seat electric pickup priced around $25,000, which first off, I want that. But secondly, that seems like such a kind of unique approach for an EV startup to just, go with this kind of affordable, mass-produced kind of item right out of the gate, which you talk about a little bit in it. And it's very different from Rivian and Tesla. It feels like something that only Amazon would really make. Like that's something that would only come out of a company like Amazon. So can you talk about kind of like how this ties into, Bezos's larger vision?
Well, first of all, we haven't seen the truck yet. So, and, nothing has been produced. So I always like to put those like clarifying points on there. We'll see what happens, but they aspire to do this low cost pickup. And the interesting piece about this is that it is very different from what almost every other EV startup has tried to do, which is usually enter at the top of the market with a high priced, low volume luxury vehicle. And then as word gets out, brand awareness, locking up supply chain, then move into a higher volume, lower priced vehicle. Tesla's done this. Rivian is attempting to do this. Lucid is still very much in the luxury market, but they are trying to be higher volume. This is different, but with also an interesting sort of twist. The idea here is that the core vehicle will be incredibly cheap, but where the margins will come into play or where they'll make money is on all the after bits, the accessories. So think how Harley Davidson makes a lot of money based on its apparel. Or Jeep maker, when you buy a Jeep, it can be very basic, but then Mopar is the aftermarket product stuff. So this is their sort of business model. We'll see how it is actually executed, though.
It's something that feels like, oh, that's a great idea. Like that's like, I would like to buy vehicles that way if it's done right. But at the same time, it really runs the risk of feeling like really nickel and dimed, where it's just like, well, like you say it's $25,000, but actually like what I get is like a piece of trash for that. And like, I actually need to spend another $25,000 to actually have a good experience.
Yeah. So that's where the execution part is going to be very interesting. Before we move on, I will say this. If you look at the timing of the deal, so the Series A was in 2023, which means discussions were probably happening a little bit before that. The company itself, Slate, was imagined and was created around 2022. And that's interesting because Rivian and Amazon are quite tied together. Amazon is a major shareholder of Rivian. They are a customer making vans. And so when I was speaking with sources at that time, Rivian was kind of struggling. And some people speculate, and I want to emphasize speculate here, that this was Jeff Bezos' plan B if, things went sideways with Rivian. Very different, obviously, but the timing itself is quite curious. And so we're going to see how it all plays out. But I actually have another deal I want to talk to you about because it's sort of wild, about Colossal Biosciences. I'm not going to use the terminology that company is using, but essentially they do some genetic tinkering and created something close to a dire wolf.
I'm gonna use the word they use, not necessarily because I fully co-sign it, but because I think it is part of understanding sort of the debate over the company and their latest announcement, which is they talk about de-extinction. And we've talked about this on past episodes of the show as well. The example people bring up a lot is Jurassic Park and the idea of let's get dinosaur DNA and bring them back. In the Colossal Biosciences case, I think they're kind of white whale, if you will, is the woolly mammoth. And to get there, they've kind of announced a few different experiments. The latest one being what they're saying is a dire wolf, which is basically wolves that have had certain genes that are, turned on. And it's led to these 2 6-month-old wolves called Romulus and Remus, who are sort of mythological figures nursed on a wolf. Although they are also clear about the inspiration from Game of Thrones, because, dire wolves were really popularized recently in Game of Thrones. And then also they have apparently another wolf named Khaleesi. But, sort of circling back again, like any piece of like press and Colossal is a very hyped company right now. Anytime they talk about it, people talk about this idea of de-extinction. And I think a number of scientists are like, I don't know that this really counts as de-extinction. What do you guys think?
Well, I was wondering, so the question posed here is, this is a company that they raised $200 million in a Series C at a $10.2 billion valuation, which is big. And I'm wondering, Max or Anthony, like, to kind of put it back to you, does this justify their valuation, or is this a very elaborate stunt that isn't going to turn into anything?
There's a certain element to this where it's very much, a stunt. Like, the dire wolves have become so popular because of Game of Thrones in recent years. Like, if you're going to bring back an animal that's going to get attention, makes sense to do a dire wolf. The company kind of says that part of the reason they are focusing on dire wolves is to help with red wolves, which are a very endangered species in North America. But the questions about what are the real world applications of this, and more kind of pressingly, like, what are the real world applications of this that can make this company billions of dollars over its lifetime? I think those are kind of some real questions that aren't quite answered. Because to me, if the ultimate purpose of this company is to help with the conservation movement, then I don't really understand how this is a $10 billion company.
Yeah, one of the things right now is that they don't charge governments for helping with endangered animal conservation, although the company has suggested that it might. They've also spun out a bunch of companies. I believe they've spun out about 2 companies and have plans to spin off 3 or more businesses over the next 2 years, one of which will be for its artificial womb technology. So I suppose there is this idea that the main company is where all the R&D and big thinking happens. And then if there's something that turns into something real, whether it's an application of some kind that it can license this technology, then it spins out and becomes a business. That is intriguing and interesting. Of course, there is the whole ethical question of whether there should be genetic tinkering and this very heavy-handed human element in conservation. But I'm not sure we're going to resolve that debate today.
I think another element of that debate, I think I've seen when people, start to get a little skeptical of that sort of de-extinction language that they use, is that I think I can imagine a scenario where, like, bringing certain species back is part of a larger conservation strategy. I think sometimes it can come across more like parts of the tech industry, like, instead of like saving what we have now, they're just focused on these sort of tech solutions that maybe will mitigate the damage decades in the future. Like, I think it's a sort of similar conversation to the conversation around like going to Mars, right? Like, which I think is, a worthy goal, but sometimes it feels like people are essentially saying that, being like, well, like, we screwed up this planet. It's too late to like worry about saving it. We're going to Mars. As opposed to being like, yeah, we can go to Mars, but like, this is our planet. This is the one we're stuck with. Like, and we can talk about Mars too, but that, that's not going to solve the fundamental issues. And I think I kind of feel the same way about these kind of genetic de-extinction ideas.
Right. There's a lot of kind of long-term problems that Colossal is trying to solve, but we have to move on. We are going to take a short break, but after the break, we're going to talk about a very near-term problem, which is the tumult of Trump's tariffs.
And we're back here to talk about all things tariffs. And if there's a theme here, I think it's just uncertainty. Because by the time this recording comes out, it may have all changed yet again. But to catch everyone up and kick off the conversation, there were what some people have, I feel, incorrectly called reciprocal tariffs, but tariffs nonetheless, a baseline of 10%, then specifically very high tariffs for certain countries. That is now being paused for 90 days. But the important thing here to remember, and what I'm really interested in hearing from you, Anthony and Max, is that there is a 90-day reprieve on tariffs. However, that baseline 10% is still in place. And more importantly, the levies on Chinese goods are now even higher, I believe, to about 125%. Now it feels like we're sitting in a legitimate US-China trade war.
Yeah, it's weird to be in this situation where that seems more reasonable than, or at least slightly less crazy than what was about to, take effect. But yeah, it's like when you talk about, oh, it's only China, I think we're about to see like how widespread only China is, because it seems clear that that's going to be a huge swath of goods, because it's not just, products that maybe have the made in China label on them, but there's also like parts and all kinds of different things where, that sort of economic relationship now has, as far as I can tell, really just been shattered.
Yeah, I think I heard an interesting quote from analyst earlier this week that said, there's always uncertainty in the markets. There's no such thing as real certainty. But it's a lot different when you wake up the next day and you're not sure if it's going to rain and whether you think there's a tornado that's going to come through your town. So this is really just like an uncharted level of kind of uncertainty that we're seeing kind of around tariffs. I think this has played out in a lot of kind of interesting ways for the AI chip world specifically. AI chips were given a cutout in Trump's original tariffs, but people still expected the other parts of building data centers to kind of dramatically rise and all the costs around that. But now it's still kind of an open question around what's really going to happen there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's important to remember and that might be missed in the conversation, but we'll see happen in the coming months, right? Right now, we're all reacting to the stock market's volatility because of this idea of around uncertainty. But the actual effect on businesses and then the trickle down effect to consumers, because pretty much every economist agrees that tariffs, the cost comes down to the consumer. There's not a lot of debate there. I don't think we understand really, and we're going to learn soon how much of a web Chinese goods are in all of our even American assembled products. So in the case of the data centers, which is really interesting, there is this carve out or exemption for semiconductors. But if you look at what a data center is filled with, it is filled with electronics hardware, many of which are made and are assembled in China. So think of server hardware like motherboards and network interface cards. Then there's the power equipment. Then there's the cooling. A lot of this stuff comes from China. And so you see analysts already talking about whether this is going to compel tech companies to slow down on this AI data center building boom. And I'm wondering, Max or Anthony, if that's sort of what you're hearing as well, or if you think that the demand for it is so high that they're just going to push forward anyway.
Right. I mean, I think that there was a certain element to the data center build out story that some companies were already slowing down building out data centers before this happened. I mean, Microsoft is a good example of this. They've canceled a lot of their data center projects reportedly in the last few weeks. And a major reason for this partially is just because Microsoft was building so many data centers to begin with. Their relationship with OpenAI is kind of getting more complicated, and it seems like they might not be on the hook for supplying all their compute in the future. But I mean, these companies are investing hundreds of billions of dollars over the next few years on the data center build out. And when you're talking about that scale, I mean, even just if, prices increase, a few percentage points, I mean, it's billions of dollars flying out the door. So I think this creates a lot more risk associated with those massive investments they're trying to make.
Yeah, to me, it's also interesting to think about this in the context of sections of Silicon Valley like really going hard for Trump in the last election. And 404 Media had this interesting piece, I think it was over the weekend, basically making the argument that folks like Mark Andreessen like really went hard for Trump. And then it turns out they've basically like endorsed a decel in chief. And like, this is very much not what they wanted. And so if you thought it was going to be, and because obviously if you can look at other policy areas like crypto and things like that, where it seems like the Trump administration is very much kind of going with what that sort of rightward libertarian leaning side of Silicon Valley wants. This is not that. And you can sort of see that I mean, A, there's just things that Trump himself believes and wants. And then also like that there are clearly very different factions within the administration who are pushing for very different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think what's going to happen is the reality of the cost of capital that is triggered by tariffs is going to be incredibly concerning for large segments of Silicon Valley and other tech leaders that may have been, aligning themselves with Trump several months ago. And when you think about this, like Max, to your point earlier about how very small percentage points can cause billions of dollars. So if you think about like the data center AI building boom, or even investments into deep tech, that was fueled by tech companies with lots of cash in a solid and fairly certain business environment. So now you have companies like Apple and others facing this like extreme uncertainty, and then they have to deal with this uncertainty and the pressure on their core business. And that could cause them to pull back, not just with data centers, by the way, but other investment areas. And that is a reversal, to Anthony's point, a pulling back. And what was top of mind for me was, how is this going to affect some of the really big moonshot style projects like Stargate?
Right. It's interesting because companies like Apple and Tesla and a lot of Elon Musk's ventures are reliant on this kind of global infrastructure that they have, and to kind of implement these tariffs and to try to onshore jobs into the United States. I mean, there's just no world where an iPhone is assembled and built completely in the United States. Like it just doesn't make sense without the cost, increasing 2 or 3 times. I am curious about Kirsten, what this means for Tesla in particular, because they are so exposed to China tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because when the 90-day pause was first announced, a lot of folks immediately reacted. We saw Tesla stock go up, and it was like, Tesla's great. But they're actually exposed. They are one of the most, quote unquote, American-built car companies out there. They have a lot of their assembly facilities in the US. They do a lot in-house, but they still rely on componentry. I mean, a story several years ago was about how they have one of their own lanes on the Texas-Mexico border for that very important, by the way, trade partner when it comes to automotive components, Mexico, very huge. So they're exposed, and specifically because it's with China, I think that they are going to get a lot more pressure than people are realizing. And actually, I think they're realizing it now a little bit more because their stock price is down again. Tesla is absolutely exposed, but other automakers are as well. Mexico and Canada are both huge trade partners. And while it's not 125% tariff like we're seeing in China, you still have that baseline 10%. And then, of course, some of the like cabling and other critical materials, battery materials are coming from China as well, which exposes really any company that is any tech company or any company that is trying to build EVs or any in-car tech. So that's not going away, even though there's this 90-day reprieve. But we have to move on to one of my other favorite topics, which is AI. I'm very curious what Max thinks of Meta releasing this Llama 4.
Yeah, so Meta did have a bit of llama drama in the last week. No, it was good. It was good. And then, so last weekend, Meta released Llama 4. There are 3 new models in total. There was a small, medium, and behemoth model. And these were kind of Meta's next generation of AI models to really kind of push their open source effort forward. Not quite open source, but they call it open source. But that's a conversation for another day. Broadly, the industry was kind of underwhelmed by this release. We're kind of getting used to a pace in the AI industry where Google releases a new model, and OpenAI releases a new model, and Anthropic releases a new model. Every month, we're seeing these releases that are just more impressive and pushing the capabilities forward. And Meta release of Llama 4 really just didn't show any new capabilities exactly. It didn't quite push the edge of what AI models can do. It didn't quite push the edge of what open source AI models can do. DeepSeek still seems to have an edge on Meta here. So it really was kind of a confusing release. But what made matters worse was that there started to be these rumors flying around that Meta had kind of gamed some of its benchmarks. Usually Meta would never kind of respond to something like this, but one of their executives actually, explicitly denied rumors that Meta tried to game benchmarks, that they specifically trained their AI models to boost benchmark results. These are these kind of AI tests that everyone loves to compare in the industry. But the thing got even worse when Meta released a version of Llama on this benchmarking site called LM Arena. And this is a place where people really care how their AI models perform against each other. But then the LM Arena, the folks who run that benchmarking site, said that Meta hadn't quite been as straightforward as they should have been, that they actually released a very different model from the one that was released more broadly. And this was a model that was basically trained to be very good at chatting, to perform well in this specific domain. So it was not a very impressive release, and it seems like Meta was kind of caught cheating to try to make it look better than it was.
Right. Although we should say, my sense is that one of those benchmarking things that you were mentioning, LM Arena, like it seems pretty clear that they did use a specific different model there. There are all these other kind of unsubstantiated rumors as well. So there's a little bit of a mix of some things that are substantiated and some that are not.
Yes. The part we know is that they did release this fine-tuned model that would perform well in this setting where the way it works is that people compare, you ask a question and then the Arena shows you two chatbot answers, one from, say, ChatGPT and one from Llama's new model, and you pick which one you like the best. And Meta released this model there that basically starts off every answer with, "What an interesting question," or "Wow, that's fascinating," with like a bright, like an I heart eye emoji. It's really weird. Apparently that does the best in that kind of setting, was what they found. But that's not how the actual model works. If you use it, if you download it on Hugging Face, totally different thing. So it was very confusing, and it raises a lot of questions about what's going on at Meta's AI division.
Okay, I do have some questions, and I'm wondering, is this, aside from being sort of a little shady and kind of underwhelming, is this Meta just getting caught at what every company is doing right now? And is there a across the board sort of dilution of progress, and that nothing that, like everything that we're hearing from every company working on this should be looked at with a sense of skepticism? Or is it Meta stands out, the one and only bad actor here?
I think the answer is yes to both, like to all of the things you just said. Like, I think that there's a certain element of this where Meta has a history of gaming, like metrics across the board on social media for kind of how they measure monthly active users, how they measure all these kinds of like clicks and whatnot for advertisers. I mean, they have a history of doing this, but everyone to a certain extent is doing this across the tech industry. Like, it's not just Meta, especially in the AI world. I mean, every company is so focused on winning and getting their model to be the top of this LM Arena kind of website. But all these benchmarks that they have out there, there's these kind of tests for coding and math and science that they're all trying to kind of get their AI model to score 1 percentage point better than another. And to me, it represents really a lack of innovation across the industry, where everyone is basically just trying to beat OpenAI, beat Anthropic, and beat Google on these very specific domains, when I think there's a lot more interesting kind of larger questions we could be asking AI models to solve. Like, okay, how do we get this AI model to really automate, my entire like email responses? Like how do we get AI models to kind of, get better at talking to people on the phone to automate customer, service assistant jobs? I mean, there's these kind of broader, bigger picture things that these AI labs seem less focused on solving, and they're really just laser focused on these tests.
I guess to play a little bit of devil's advocate, would the argument be that like the models, these core models, they're not necessarily going to be focused on a specific use case, and really that's up to sort of maybe startups, whatever, to like maybe then take advantage of Llama or OpenAI or whatever, what have you, and they're going to build these more focused applications.
Right. I mean, that's the idea, definitely. Like if you build a more capable model, people can do more with them. But I think that what we're seeing is that these models, while they're performing better at these tests, that in some ways that's the only thing they're getting better at. Like with this Llama 4 model, it looked like it was better on all of these tests. But the reality when people used it was like, this is really nothing new. Whereas other models, I will say like Google's Gemini 2.5 Pro that they just released, people have started using that in like their, coding workflows. I've talked to a lot of people who have used that and they say, this AI tool, we plug it in and it solves things that we couldn't solve before. Like it just makes things work. So to some extent, like there is some credibility to what you're saying, but I think across the board, we're seeing too much focus on these benchmarks and it makes them not a very reliable indicator.
Yes. Creating something to do well on a test doesn't always translate to good business. Unfortunately, we have to go now, but we'll be paying attention to your coverage, Max, on all things AI. And thanks again for joining. But Equity will be back next week. Until then, you can find Equity under the handle @EquityPod on X and Threads.
Equity is produced by Theresa Loconsolo with editing by Kell. We'd also like to thank TechCrunch's audience development team. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.